Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here with a bittersweet video for you today. This isn't a video I thought I'd be making anytime soon, but sometimes you never know what the universe is going to throw at you, and you just have to roll with the changes. As many of you know, my little yellow Cessna 120 was damaged pretty badly in a severe windstorm last January, when a gust of wind hit the plane and bent the wing strut and caused damage to the wing. And after spending all summer trying to find a replacement wing and talking to a guy who can rebuild wings, I was having no luck finding a replacement. And the thought of going into winter with a broken plane, with really no end in sight, didn't really want to do that. And so I made the difficult decision to sell my beloved little Cessna. As you can imagine, it was a very emotional event for me, and so this video might follow and be pretty emotional. But you know, right after I sold her, a couple days later, I went over to take the wing covers over, and so last Sunday I spent quite a bit of time over there saying my final farewells to my beloved 3102 November. And so I decided to make this video partly as a cathartic experience for me, and also because I know that a lot of you guys have been following me for a long time. I know that some of you have been following me for the entire time I've owned the plane, which was 2011. I bought the little yellow Cessna in May of 2011. And I know that some of you guys have been following me throughout the whole time I've known her, and especially Fuji users, because my ownership of this little yellow plane basically paralleled my time with the X series cameras, or my development with the X series camera. Bought the plane in 2011, bought my first Fuji, the X10, in 2011. And the next winter I started shooting aerials with my little plane and was just blown away by how they turned out. And then I moved on to the X20 and the XE1, and then of course shooting with the XT1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You know, all of which saw so much time in the little Cessna, because it was such an integral part of my life for all those years. And so I wanted to make this video for you guys who've been following me for a while, who have seen this part of my life, so that you can kind of, you know, relive some of these memories with me, and also join me, and you know, you can say your own farewells. Because this was a very significant chapter in my life that has just closed. Truly the end of an era, and that's a really big deal for me. For those of you who have followed me for a long time, you were the first people to see these photos when I shot these aerials and then post them on social media after my flight. So yeah, this is going to be a trip down memory lane for you. And some of you are my friends and followers that even flew with me. In fact, there were some people I met on social media and made friends with, and they actually came to Alaska and I took them flying, which was really cool. I took my neighbor flying, I took a number of really good friends flying, I took my dad flying, my sister, my wife, and I also have some new followers and some dear friends who I've only known for a short time, who might know I'm a pilot and who've, you know, seen some of the photos I've shot with the little plane and maybe watched a couple of my videos, but who didn't know me through most of this time. And so I wanted to make this for you guys as well, to show you what this part of my life was like, because so much of my identity as an adventurer and a photographer have been tied to this little yellow plane that was with me and took me on so many amazing adventures. Seriously, some of the most amazing adventures I've ever had in my entire life. And some of the most, what I feel are the most amazing collection of photos that I've ever shot in my entire career were made either out the window of this little Cessna or shot because I was able to use her to get out to places where you can't drive, out in the Alaska wilderness, so I could go shoot glaciers and landscapes and mountains and things. I was the Fuji using Alaska photographer bush pilot in a world full of drones. Over the years, when some people found out I was an aerial photographer, people would actually tell me, "You should get a drone." It's like, I don't need a drone. I have an airplane. I have the world's best drone, and it has a range that's longer than 2 miles, and the battery lasts more than 15 minutes. I had so many amazing adventures with this little plane. With the unparalleled access that she granted me, I did so many hiking trips out in the wilderness. We went fishing for salmon. We went bear watching down on the shores of the Cook Inlet. One of the first things I did when I bought the little plane was put 26-inch Alaskan bushwheel tundra tires on her. And this allowed me to land on gravel bars and beaches and mud flats and dirt strips and out in the tundra. It's amazing the places that we were able to go together. And that little plane performed really well. And if there were no obstructions, like no trees on the other end of the strip, I could get in and out of a 550, 600-foot strip. If there were trees, then I probably need about 800 or 900 feet. If there was somebody with me, then the plane was obviously heavier and I'd need about 1,000 feet. strip to get off. And one of my favorite things to do would be to go find new strips to land on, places where I hadn't landed before. And so I'd fly around these gravel bars and tundra benches and just look for flat spots, or maybe places that people had landed before, maybe established strips, but I hadn't been there before. So I would go fly around these areas, and if I saw a potential spot, I had this process that I would go through. And the first thing I would do is just overfly the strip and just give it a general view, make sure that it looked landable or potentially landable. And then I would circle around and line up and make a low pass, maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground at 70 miles an hour ground speed. And I could see that with the GPS, is how fast I was moving over the ground. Because at 70 miles an hour, I cover about 100 feet per second. So I would fly over these strips and count. And if I was able to count 600 or 700 feet, then I knew that I was pretty safe. That would be a potential place I could land and take off safely. And so then, once I established that, I would circle around, get in, make a little pattern, and I would go in and I would attempt to land. And I would give myself 3 tries, because sometimes the wind was a little freaky, or sometimes as I got lower, the terrain looked a little challenging. And so sometimes I wouldn't land, I would just fly over. And I would give myself 3 chances. And if at the end of the 3 chances it didn't look good, or I wasn't 100% comfortable, then I would just bail and just say, okay, I'm not landing there. And so it's those little elements of risk management that you learn as a pilot and a backcountry pilot to keep you safe as you're flying in this challenging terrain. Because there is a lot of risk involved in mountain flying. Because if I'm in a situation where I have an accident or crashed a plane or damaged something, I could be a very long way away from being rescued. So you have to take that into consideration every time you go out and fly, especially here in Alaska, where we have massive, massive wilderness. And if you do go down, there is a chance that you won't be found, depending on where you go. As much risk that I did exercise out there, I also kept it in check and flew what I felt really smartly, because I'm still here and my little plane is still here and we never crashed. So I'm really proud of the fact that I flew 600 or 700 hours in my little Cessna and I never crashed her. And over the years, I landed in some really, really cool areas. Like I said, I landed on high tundra benches in the mountains. I landed in front of glaciers. And actually, that was one of my favorite things to do in the summertime, was try to find landing strips or sandbars that are close enough to some of these glaciers where I could get out and walk and hike and thread my way through the moraine and eventually work my way up all the way onto the ice of some of these glaciers. And so over the years, I actually was able to do this and hike on the Knik Glacier, a couple different places, and the Triumvirate Glacier, and the Kahiltna Glacier, which is one of the major glaciers that runs all the way down off of Denali in Denali National Park. And sometimes these adventures would require a lot of bushwhacking, a lot of really unstable footing, and kind of threading my way through this terrain, just trying to navigate the little maze of the landscape where I could actually get out onto the ice. Because the moraine is basically a big pile of mud and rock over ice, and it's really jumbled. It can be slippery because there's ice right underneath the mud and rock, and the footing is not always stable. So it was tricky sometimes, but it was really adventurous and rewarding when I finally was able to pass that part of the moraine and walk out onto bare ice on these glaciers. And yeah, I grew up in Kansas when I was in junior high. And so for me to grow up and be an Alaskan bush pilot who walks on glaciers, I mean, what can I possibly say about that? That was really, really cool. And it's that kind of stuff that just blows my mind that I was able to do with this little plane. And in fact, my good friend and I, who I would fly with all the time, I learned so much from him. We would often fly and we would always say, I can't believe they let you do this. We can just go fly around these mountains and land wherever we want and go walk on the glacier. I can't believe they let you do this. And of course you can do this because out in the wilds of Alaska, there's really no airspace. There are definitely air restrictions over Anchorage, over the city. But once you get out into the wilderness, you can go wherever you want and pretty much do whatever you want in your little plane, as long as you're responsible and don't put yourself and any other pilots in danger or any other people in danger. I spent a lot of time in the first few years of owning the plane practicing short takeoff and landings, just getting a feel for how the plane behaved and how it performed, and learning how to maximize the performance of the plane. And because it wasn't a very powerful plane, it wasn't a Super Cub with like a 180 horse engine, it was this little tiny Cessna with an 85 horsepower engine. And so it didn't have a lot of power. I couldn't just power my way in and out of stuff. And so I was very diligent about practicing. We would go out to one of the gravel strips and mark out 100-foot increments. And then one of us would be on the ground, the other guy would go and land, and then we'd measure. And so this gave me a really solid feel for how much runway I actually needed to land and take off. And so then I can use those skills and that knowledge when I'm out flying in the bush and landing on real backcountry strips and gravel bars and stuff. So I learned a ton, and I gained a huge amount of skill as a pilot flying that little plane. And I flew her pretty much to the edge of her abilities. You know, and in the summertime, it was just glorious. I'd just go over and I'd take off in the evening and fly around all these mountains and stuff and just go hiking until midnight, and I'd come home and it's still not dark by the time I get home at like 1 in the morning. And then I would come home and make dinner, and sometimes I'm eating dinner at like 1:45 or 2 in the morning in the summertime. And it was just these glorious summer days. You know, that's what life, like, this is living. This is Alaska living at its finest. But I also flew her in the wintertime. And actually that coincided with one of my all-time favorite activities in my little Cessna, which was shooting winter aerials over the mountains. And this is the most rewarding thing that I've ever done as a photographer, to create this body of work of aerial mountain photography, these sunset aerials that I would shoot. And it wasn't easy. In fact, it was a ton of work. The best time to do these were like late November through December, January, early February. And that's when the air was the clearest and the coldest. And you know, you'd have these magnificent, clear, beautiful days where the sun is low in the sky and just skimming across, which means you have basically magic hour golden, pink, yellowish light all afternoon. And so I'd go over to the plane about noon, and I would, you know, use an MXR XGK stove, and I had like the 4-piece of aluminum dryer duct, and I would put that on the ground and put the dryer duct, put the little stovepipe up into the engine so I could preheat the engine. And so while the stove was burning for about an hour, I would then go shovel out the spot and deal with the wing covers and the engine covers and, you know, brush everything off. And that usually took about 45 minutes to an hour. And by then the engine was preheated enough that I could start the plane, because it's really difficult to start a cold engine. And so having it nice and warm would ensure that I could start it. And for the first number of years that I owned the plane, I just had a regular car battery. So this heavy car battery that basically sat behind me. And so of course this meant that if it was really cold out, I mean, I'm over there, it might be 0 degrees or 10 below or something, the regular starter just wouldn't work. And so I had to hand prop the plane. And I knew how to do this because I learned how to hand prop the very second time I flew the plane. I landed on this gravel bar in the summertime, and the generator failed. It was basically a 1940s Delco car generator, and it failed. And so I'm out there on the gravel bar. I was like, I gotta figure out how to start the plane. And I knew how to do it, but I developed this system that would work for me and that was safe for me to do. And so I would basically, you know, get inside, adjust the throttle, turn the mags on, turn the switch, the ignition switches on, and then I would walk around to the passenger door, open that, prop it open, and then I would grab the strut on the passenger side, and then I would, you know, pull down on the prop. And if the plane was properly warmed up, or if it was summertime, second pull almost every time. And then I would run around to the passenger door, pull the throttle out, because you don't want the throttle to be too high, because then the plane will start to roll away if it's not tied down. And then I'd close the door, run around to the pilot side, get in and get in and do all this stuff and start going. Same thing in the wintertime, except really freaking cold. But again, if the plane was properly heated, then it would start right up on the second pull. Sometimes it wasn't warm enough and I would just sit there and pull and pull and pull the prop and it wouldn't start. I'm like, ugh. So then I would have to put the engine cover back on and then put the stove back on and run it for another 20 minutes or so. But yeah, that's pilot life if you don't have a hangar here in Alaska. And so once I got the engine running, I would taxi and then I would take off, and it might be about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, about an hour before sunset. And I would take off and I would fly towards the mountains and start climbing up. And I would climb to about 7, 8, 9,000 feet. And by the time I got over kind of the heart of the mountains where I wanted to photograph, the light was just becoming more brilliant. And so I would get my camera around my neck and I would open the window. And it was great because it didn't have a little bracket. I could just open the window and the wind blast would just hold it right up, right below the wing. And so I had this big open window and I would just fly with my left hand and shoot with my right hand using the LCD screen on the camera. And I would just fly and make kind of shallow passes and circles by these mountains when the sun was the most brilliant. And I would just shoot photos, just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and capture entire sequences as I flew by these peaks. And of course, when the overture started to this symphony of magic light, I would just go nuts and just capture so many frames. And I'd look for angles and look for peaks and just look for different features in the landscape that I wanted to capture. And for me, it was all about the contrast. I mean, I would have these amazing physical forms of the peak, the shapes, these dramatic mountain shapes. But it was always a wonderful contrast of this pink-orange light against the deep blue shadows of the valleys and the areas that weren't lit by the sun. And so using the Fuji film simulations like Velvia and Provia, I would capture this brilliant, amazing light, and which would keep increasing in intensity as the symphony went on. And finally, you would have the crescendo when the light was at its absolute peak before it started to fade and the sun dipped below the horizon. And those were the most magical times for me because I was literally the only one up there, unless I had somebody in the plane with me. I took a friend flying. But other than that, I never saw anybody else out there. I was the only person seeing these magical displays of light on these mountains. There was nobody else in the entire world who was seeing what I was seeing. And so over the years, it's always been so incredibly meaningful for me to share with you these moments that I witnessed up in the sky. And so I'm thrilled that you guys have enjoyed seeing these photos over all these years. And I'll keep sharing that stuff because I have, years and years worth of aerial photos in my catalog, and many of which I haven't posted. But again, I'm up there and I'm just thinking to myself, I can't believe they let you do this. So yeah, my life in the wintertime flying was a lot of work with a huge payoff. Having the plane is almost like cheating. It's like I have this amazing tool that like most people don't have. That's why it's sad for me that this chapter's over, and because it was such a significant part of my life for so many years. So let's talk a little bit about 3102 November. Let you know a little bit more about her and who she was. Cessna Model 120, serial number 13360, rolled off the assembly line in Wichita, Kansas at the Cessna plant on April 11th, 1947. Like I said, Model 120, which meant she had an aluminum fuselage and fabric wings, an 85 horsepower motor. And she was a tail dragger, which meant that the third wheel is in the back. And so the plane kind of sits like this, with the front of the plane here. And that's how most of the planes were in the older days. And it wasn't until later when tricycle gear planes started to be more in vogue, where the front wheel is in front of the engine. And so that makes tail draggers a little bit more tricky to fly because the back wheel is behind the center of gravity, which means that if you're moving straight on the ground going forward, the back wheel wants to spin around, kind of like a shopping cart wheel. And so you have to be really careful and diligent on the rudders to make sure that the back wheel doesn't spin around. And you don't want a ground loop, and that's what it's called when the whole plane spins around. And that can happen, and if it's a fast enough ground loop, you can actually tilt it and damage the wing. You can hit the wing on the runway or the ground. But these little Cessna 120s were really easy to fly. And I remember the first time I flew her, I went out to test her with a friend who was an instructor, and we landed on some gravel bars, and I was so surprised at how easy she was to fly. Because I had done my tail wheel endorsement in a Citabria, which is an aerobatic plane and much more twitchy and tricky with the tail wheel and the rudders. And I remember taking the Citabria out one time by myself. I scared the hell out of myself, and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to do that again. But this little 120 was so easy to fly and such a joy. And she really was so docile. So one of the most critical things in an airplane is to not stall. And that's when you go too slow or you increase your angle of attack too much, where it disrupts the airflow over the wing and the plane loses lift. And when that happens, it'll just kind of drop And if you're high enough in the sky, it's pretty easy to recover. But a lot of times, if you stall too close to the ground, you're going to crash. And a lot of people have died stalling too close to the ground. Well, the nice thing about this little 120 is that it almost didn't stall. I would go practice in the sky and I would slow the plane down and pull it back and pull it back and pull it back until I'm flying like 35 miles an hour, which is below the landing speed. And I would be up there just pulling the power back and pulling the plane back, going slower and slower and slower. And finally it just goes, and then it's flying again. Like this little tiny dip forward and then it's flying again. And so it was really comforting to know that it had this capability and this level of safety built into it. The 120s and the 140s, which were basically 120s with flaps and a slightly bigger engine, because 120 had no flaps. And flaps basically let you take off and land a little bit slower airspeed, which ideally are great for a short takeoff and landing. But I didn't have flaps and I learned how to take off pretty short. And I had this little trick that I would do sometimes where if it was really short, I would rev the engine and then just, rolling down the runway, maybe a gravel bar, some kind of bouncing down the rocks. And right before I hit my flying speed, I would quickly turn the yoke, pull back, and turn it back. So basically I would make one of the ailerons drop and give myself a temporary flap for just a brief second, which would help pop it off the ground. And then I would straighten out and start flying. And so that's just one little trick I learned over the years. And I used it a lot of times, and it was pretty cool. And it definitely worked. So yeah, the Cessna 120s and 140s were built between 1946 and 1949, and they were built as general aviation aircraft kind of to appeal to pilots returning from World War II. And so this was a recreational plane for them to continue with their flying. And there were about, 4,000 of them built. And of course, 78 years later, which is how old 0 to November is, there just aren't as many of them out there anymore. I remember being on one of the Cessna forums and seeing that 3103 November had crashed. And so that's, one more taken out of service. And so that was really sad when I saw that. Like I said, I'm really glad that I didn't crash my plane. And even though it's damaged, I'm hoping the rest of the plane's still good, it just needs a new wing. So anyway, this little plane came off the assembly line in 1947, and within a week, it had its first owner, a guy named R.G. Fuelberth, who had a flight school called Wayne's Air Service in Wayne, Nebraska. And he had the plane for about 8 years, I think. And I actually talked to R.G.'s son on the phone one time, and he's like, yeah, I don't remember exactly that plane, but yeah, Dad had a whole bunch of planes out on his flight school. And so basically 0 to November spent the first 8 years of her life teaching people how to fly. And so I think that's really cool. Eventually she was sold to somebody else, and it was in 1961 when she made her way to California. I talked to a retired dentist, 90-year-old gentleman who lives in San Francisco. He owned the plane for a couple of years, and he told me he used to fly it around Northern California. He even said he still has the keys, and he'd send them to me. So the ignition is just switches, but there's a key lock on the door, which I've never had the key. And he said he'd send them to me, but he never showed up, so maybe he forgot. Over her life, she's had about 35 owners, and I'm the one who's owned her by far the longest. Last year, one of the owners, who was the last person owner in California, had her for a number of years, sent me an envelope full of photos of 0 to November that he shot back in the day. So it was really cool to see that. And he told me about the bullet holes. Wait, what? Bullet holes? So on the bottom of the fuselage, there are two little tiny round aluminum patches, and there's one like that on the tail as well. And from what this guy told me, 0 to November was being flown over a pot field sometime in California in the 50s and was shot at. And after that, I scoured the logbooks. I had the logbooks for the engine and the airframe all the way back to the beginning. And back then, the logbook was like the pilot record. So I could see all of the flight times for like the first few years of her history. But anyway, I scoured all of the logbooks looking for an entry that said something like patch bullet holes, but I didn't see any. So whoever did patch them would just not include that in the logbooks, because you start telling the FAA that, oh yeah, I'm patching bullet holes in my plane, you just don't want to raise those kind of eyebrows. You just don't want, that's just more paperwork, more headaches. So patched them up, just forget about it. But I thought about that every time I went out and saw that little patch on the tail and the two on the fuselage. So after spending 28 years in California with a number of different owners, 02 November finally made her way to Alaska in 1989, where she's been ever since. She started in Homer, and then she had a number of years in Anchorage and Wasilla and Palmer, some different areas around Anchorage. So 02 November has lived a long and prosperous life with so many adventures and so many different owners. And unfortunately, my time with her came to an end because of what happened. So last January, we had this hellacious windstorm. So this is a radar shot of that actual storm. And you can see it's massive. And there were like 100-mile-an-hour winds blowing in from the south. And I remember being at home that night when it happened. It blew so hard that night, on the night of January 12th, that there was a lot of damage around town, including one of the pedestrian bridges. Across Anchorage, we have a number of these really big pedestrian footbridges that go over some of the highways and the major thoroughfares. And that storm was so strong that it completely blew one of the bridges off of mounts and just like threw it onto the highway. I know that that's the storm that did her in because a guy who was parked behind me told me, because he came by the next day and saw the damage and didn't know who I was or how to contact me. But I would imagine that the gust, or one of the gusts that blew that pedestrian bridge off, is what did her in. You know, she weathered 14 years of windstorms, because we have hellacious windstorms every winter and every fall up here in Alaska, but they're not always that strong. Now, the ironic thing is that the only reason I was able to own 02 November is because the exact same thing happened to her left wing in 2010, which was a year before I bought her. There was another hellacious windstorm that buckled her left strut and caused damage to the left wing. And so she was sold to an insurance company and ended up in a hangar somewhere at Wolf Lake, which is an airport about 40 miles to the north of Anchorage. And this young mechanic named Mario Macaroni saw her advertised and heard about her somehow, and he bought her and he towed her back to his hangar because he lived at Wolf Lake, and he fixed her up, including driving to Whitehorse and buying another wing and trailering it all the way back. And he fixed her up and he did a really wonderful job, and then he advertised her, and I just happened to be looking for a plane right at that time, and so serendipitously I was able to get her. So after she was damaged in January, I didn't even know. I was traveling quite a bit, but I would go by regularly and just drive by the airport just to make sure that everything looked okay. And my friend Chet would do that too. And apparently from a distance, you couldn't see the damage. And it wasn't until April when I went over to the plane to take the wing covers off and kind of get it ready for spring. And I was literally standing underneath the wing doing the tie downs, like adjusting the tie down rope. And I looked up and I saw all this fabric damage, like all these places where the fabric had peeled off from the underside of the right wing. And I was like, what the? And I looked, I was like, it's all over the wing. And then I saw the bent strut. You know, in my mind, I think there was a part of me that knew that that might be the end of the line for me with her, because I know how much it costs to fix a wing. I actually had a wing guy come over to look at her, and I talked to him on the phone, and he gave me a really, really rough ballpark, which is basically more than the total cost of the plane. So I spent all summer trying to find a replacement wing. And there was one in California, and there was one in Alberta, but one of them might have needed work, which would have cost more time and more money. But even the prospect of getting them up here, it just was logistically didn't seem very possible for me, because I don't have any way to transport a 14.5-foot wing like 4,000 miles across the country. I also can't count on somebody to crate it all up, to put it on a truck and bring it here. And then the wing shows up, what do I do with it? I don't have a place to store a wing. So like I said, as I got later on in the fall and things just weren't working out, I just decided I didn't want to go into winter with a broken plane. So, like I said, I made that decision to sell her, and it was a tough one. But I had gotten to the place in my mind where I knew it was the right decision, because I wasn't going to be the one who could fix 02 November. And I sold her to the guy who owns an aircraft salvage yard, And he told me that rather than part her out and just, break her up into pieces and sell pieces, he was going to do his best to find somebody who can actually fix the wing and get her flying again. So hopefully she will have a new owner soon, and she'll be back in the sky at some point, and maybe I'll see her out there. But for now, I can just look back at my time with 02 November and know that she was such a special thing in my life. She was this beautiful little beloved Cessna that taught me so much about myself and flying and shared so many amazing adventures with me. I mean, like I said, the best in my entire life, and allowed me to shoot the most amazing photos that I've ever shot in my entire career. And one of the last things I did when I went over, before I gave her a final walk around and make sure her tie downs were tight and kissed her engine compartment, because that little engine kept me safe all those years, was sit down on the tarmac and paint a picture of her, because I've been doing watercolors more. And part of the reason that I decided to sell her was because my hours have been diminishing. But you guys know I had a shoulder injury, and that kept me out of the sky. And then I've been cycling and racing a lot more, and doing a lot of trips and traveling more. So yeah, it was the right decision. Maybe I'll buy another plane at some point, but right now, I just don't see it happening anytime soon. But I can look back at my time with 02 November with such fondness about this incredible chapter in my life that we lived together. So for all of you guys who've been following me over the years, this is your goodbye to her as well. And for those of you who are just following me and my dear friends who I've just recently met, who may have seen my aerials and maybe even have a couple of prints, that's what it was like for me. That's who I was for so many years. This is what my little yellow plane and I went through together in the past 14 years. So now you know me a little bit better and how I was able to get those photos. So for now, I just want to say thanks to all of you for watching and joining in with me as I say my final farewells to my beloved little yellow plane, 02 November. So please leave a comment if you feel like doing so. I always answer everyone that I get. And you can find me on social media at Dan Bailey Photo, and visit my website and blog as well. So I wish you all the best of luck with your photography and adventures this coming season, and I'll see you next time.